Hi everyone, this is Bruce Baldwin, and it's a real pleasure to be able to take part in this workshop today, and I thank you all for participating. So I'm going to be your tour guide of the Helianthe Alliance, one of the more diverse clades of the sunflower family today. And it's a group I've been working on, well, small parts of it that is, for over 35 years. I want to share some of the changes that have come about in our understanding of this group over time, and try to give you some appreciation for the magnificent diversity of plants that are included within it in terms of how to understand the different tribes and distinguish them. So the Helianthe Alliance is a group that's also been called Supertribe Heliantheae by Harold Robinson. He named it not too long ago. It's a clade that takes in about 25% of the species within the Compositae or Asteraceae. And these are for the most part New World taxa, especially being diverse in the drier, more subtropical parts of the New World. There are taxa that occur widely within Eurasia and even in Africa, but these are the results of long-distance dispersal events and some lineages that have become circumboreal. But for the most part, this group is New World, with the exception of one clade that's sister to the rest that I'll talk about in a moment. And the relationships within the Helianthe Alliance were long misunderstood because of too much emphasis being placed on particular characteristics that I'll talk about. But in general, the Helianthe Alliance takes in broad groups of Compositae that have commonly been referred to as the sunflower tribe, or the sneezeweed group, and the Eupatoriae as well, which is an important member that was only recently recognized to belong to the same clade. So if we look across the group, there's one feature morphologically that unites most of the members of the Helianthe Alliance, and this is the presence of a layer of phytomelanin within the fruit walls that imparts this blackish coloration to the fruits, like you're familiar with from a sunflower fruit shown in the upper left here. This is what we call carbonized fruit, or blackened fruit. And you can see on the lower right an immature fruit cross-section of Porophyllum ruderale and the Tigidae, or marigold tribe. Actually, where you see the arrow here, this is a developing layer of this phytomelanin. And if we look at the overall phylogeny of the Helianthe Alliance, which is excerpted here from a publication by Jennifer Mandel et al., a phylogenomic analysis of the overall family, published in 2019 in PNAS, we can see the relationships among the members of the Helianthe Alliance, including the Inulae, which is not included within the Helianthe Alliance. Up at the top, that's always been recognized as a distinct tribe, and it's strictly Old World in its membership. You can see the biogeographic reconstructions at the nodes of this phylogeny, with a legend in the lower left that shows the different parts of the world color-coded. And you can see that the sister to the rest of the Helianthe Alliance, and with a red arrow there, the Athroismae, is an Old World endemic group, an African group of low diversity. The numbers in parentheses after the tribal names are the number of species estimated for each tribe. And you can see that it's estimated to have had a Central or Southern African origin, where we find the diversity in this group. But the rest of the Helianthe Alliance, below that Athroismae, in the clade branching off sister to Athroismae, is New World. There are some Old World members, but as I mentioned, they're outliers. And this is a primarily New World group. The reconstructions are a little equivocal with regard to exactly where these different branching events took place, but somewhere in the New World, more in the southerly part of the New World, except for some of the more apical branches there. In any case, you can see that carbonized fruits are shaded light blue across this clade. And carbonized fruits then are characteristic of the vast majority, one large clade within the Helianthe Alliance, exclusive of the Heliantheae. And within a Throisme, we have variation for presence or absence of carbonized fruits. So I'm just going to briefly show you an example of the tribe Throisme, this African group. And it's strictly paleotropical. They have spherical secondary heads. So we have a glomeriform capitulescence shown at the bottom of this illustration, which comes from a monograph by Torsten Eriksson. And you can see an individual head removed in the upper part of this panel. And on either side at the top, you can see florets. On the left, a pistillate floret from this disciform head with its very reduced corolla and an associated filary to the outside. And on the right, we see a disc floret with its associated palea, or receptacular bract. So the heads of a Throisme, in this particular part of the Throisme, that is, that includes the Throisma itself, are palliate and also have blackened fruits, and you can see the dark fruit walls there. Even though there are only about 55 species in this tribe, there are other members of this tribe that don't have blackened fruits. So there is some variation here. And as I mentioned, there are palea in the head that I just showed you. And palea, the presence of these receptacular bracts through the head, is a characteristic that's been associated with the sunflower tribe Heliantheae for many years. So the presence of these palea is something we can see in this sunflower head where the disc florets have been removed in this lower left sector, as well as the ray florets around the periphery in the lower left. And we can see remaining here these white ovaries that are immature, that still aren't manifesting the dark phytomelanin pigment that'll make them black later. But we can see here the palea emerging, these little projections coming out around these ovaries that represent receptacular bracts subtending each one of the disc florets. And this is a feature that we see across much of the Helianthe Alliance within what we often call the core Heliantheae, the set of tribes as are recognized today that have generally been included within the Heliantheae in past circumscriptions, the presence of these palea or receptacular bracts being something that has been considered diagnostic of the tribe. Palea are found in other parts of the Compositae as well, but they're relatively sporadic occurrence relative to what we see within the Helianthe Alliance. And if we go all the way back to Cassini's classifications in the early 1800s, Henry Cassini made wonderful contributions to our understanding of composite relationships. The most insightful early student of the family, and he circumscribed the tribe Helianthe very broadly to include not only these palliate members with receptacular bracts through the head, like in core Helianthe, but also included some epalliate Hellenioid taxa that often have been excluded from the tribe that lack the palea. And in his system, you can see that we have a number of groups associated with tribe Helianthe here at the bottom, but notably not the Eupatoriae up here near the top. We'll talk more about it in a moment. And you can see here from Jennifer Mandel et al.'s phylogeny, as in earlier analyses going all the way back to 1995 when Kim and Jansen presented an analysis based on chloroplast DNA, that the Eupatoriae are nested highly within the Helianthe Alliance, or within the Helianthe as it used to be circumscribed in the broadest senses. And so this was a conundrum, and it's been reinforced now by this phylogenomic study. You can see the Eupatoriae are the most diverse recognized tribe within the Helianthe Alliance with over 2,000 species. And this presented a dilemma back in the early 2000s when this was reinforced by a number of lines of evidence of either having to lump the Eupatorii into the Heliantheae to make basically a tribe that included 25% of all species in the family, highly heterogeneous in its morphology and ecology, or to break up the Helianthe Alliance into a number of natural monophyletic tribes, which now number about 15, most of which are included in this analysis shown here. And so this is the basis for much of the change that's happened, although there's been a radical improvement in our understanding of relationships within this group, which was an exciting thing to be part of back in the late 90s, early 2000s. It's only improved over time. So if we look at the distribution of taxa that have palliate heads, like the sunflower within the Helianthe Alliance, we can see that these palliate tribes represent more than one clade. So they don't constitute a clade taken together. The Metae, shown here in the center, highlighted, only about half of the members there are actually palliate, and the Athroismi I didn't highlight in this particular diagram at the top also, as I mentioned, include palliate members as well. So it's clear that having palliate heads is not diagnostic of a clade, and that characteristic wasn't sufficient by itself as a feature allowing us to basically recognize a larger assemblage of composites. And this is true when we look at both nuclear DNA as well as chloroplast DNA, that this core of Helianthe in the broad sense that had palliate heads don't really constitute a clade. Here are some of the tribes, most of the tribes that have been recognized that are palliate heads, and they include the core Helianthe in the new sense, and then 4 other tribes here, 2 of which are quite diverse with hundreds of species, namely the Coreopsideae, the Coreopsis tribe in the upper left, and the Millerieae down at the bottom in the middle. And I want to talk more about these different tribes to give you a better feeling for the diversity within these groups. So first, the Helianthe in the strict sense that we recognize it in today includes about 113 genera and around roughly 1,500 species. So it's one of the most diverse tribes of the Helianthe Alliance still. And some of the features that help to unite it are fruits that are usually flattened. So they're usually compressed fruits, as we can see in the encelia down here in the lower central panel. And also, as you can see there, the palea, or receptacular bracts, are often conduplicate, folded around the flattened fruit. And this is a feature that's widespread within the tribe. Also, the phyllaries, or involucral bracts, are herbaceous in this group. They're green, and sometimes actually leaf-like or foliaceous, as we can see in this Wyeathia up in the upper left here, where you can see these leaf-like phyllaries. The leaves are also often tripline-nerved and scabrous, like we see in the Bahiopsis in the lower right here. And the pappus is generally, if present, of awns or scales that are arrayed in kind of a linear array. Since the fruits are flattened, at least, they appear to be in a linear array, with often the largest elements out at the periphery of the flattened dimension. And so these features taken together are fairly helpful. And I should mention that some of these features, like the foliaceous phyllaries, led some botanists to suggest that the tribe Helianthe was basically embodied an ancestral plexus that from which the other tribes of Compositae emerged. That is, having these large yellow radiate heads with foliaceous bracts, and having palea or receptacular bracts through the head was an ancestral feature of the family But in fact, it's not. Those features are derived, and it's an interesting change in our understanding that's come from the phylogeny. And some of the most derived morphologies we see within the Helianthe Alliance occur within the subtribe Ambrosianae, the ragweed subtribe of the Heliantheae tribe in the strict sense. And these have heads that are almost not recognizable as heads of Compositae, largely because they represent radically derived conditions following a shift to wind pollination. And as you know from many different plant families, shifts to wind pollination can lead to a cascade of evolutionary changes promoting wind pollination that have led to a lot of taxonomic confusion. And in fact, Henry Cassini felt that the ragweed group represented a separate tribe from the Heliantheae and excluded it. So wind-pollinated florets are the condition found throughout this group, where we see unisexual flowers, as we see in other wind-pollinated groups of plants. And sometimes these unisexual florets are found in the same head, in which case the heads are disciform. They don't have showy rays. They have marginal peripheral florets. In Iva, for example, the poverty weeds, where we have a very reduced corolla, and then we have central staminate functional florets. Or in some genera like Ambrosia and Xanthium, shown in the lower panels here, we have staminate heads and pistillate heads. So we can see here in Ambrosia and Xanthium, the staminate heads are towards the terminus of the capitulescence, and the pistillate heads are proximal within that capitulescence. Interestingly, unlike other composites, the anthers are free in the Ambrosianae. So if you were a specialist of the Ambrosianae, you could argue that you aren't actually a synanthrologist, synanthrology being the term used for Compositae specialists, but in fact the anthers are not fused in this particular subtribe, which is a derived condition associated with the shift to wind pollination. Also, the pistillate heads themselves can be a unit of dispersal rather than the fruits or cypselae. You can see this in Ambrosia salsola in the lower left here. These membranous scarious filaries function in wind or water dispersal of the entire head. And in Xanthium in the lower right here, you can see these spiny pistillate heads where the hooked spines on the filaries allow for these to become easily attached to fur or feathers and be carried by animals. So the Coreopsideae are the third major group of, this is the second major clade of the Helianthe Alliance that we've talked about today. The second of the ones also that have palliate heads primarily. And this is a group that includes roughly 550 species in about 30 genera. And these are predominantly subtropical dryland plants, getting down into some wetter habitats in the southern part of the range for sure, as in this Cosmos palmeri shown here in the lower right. The Coryopsids are pretty well diagnosable morphologically. They have dimorphic filaries usually, with outer filaries being green and spreading, as we can see in the Leptocyne bigelovii and Leptocyne gigantea here, and the inner filaries often being chartaceous or papery or membranous, scarious, and often erect and held tightly against the rest of the head. Of course, the receptacles are palliate, as they are in the Heliantheae, and some recent analyses, as well as some of the earlier analyses, show Coreopsideae sister to Heliantheae in the strict sense. The fruits are obcompressed, that is, they're compressed in the dorsiventral dimension from front to back. So if we look in this longitudinal section of the head, we're looking at in the lower left, the Leptocynae gigantea. We can see we're looking at the narrow edge of the filary there. Yes, and also the narrow edge of the cypselae, the fruits. So the pappus, if present, is generally of awns and rarely of scales in this particular tribe. Okay, so that's a brief survey of Coreopsids. So the third major tribe of paleo members of the Helianthe Alliance is tribe Millerieae, and this group includes nearly 400 species and about 34 or 35 genera. These tend to have a more subtropical distribution overall. So the leaves are generally opposite, as in many Heliantheae, and the foliage in general is often notably glandular. The palea are present again, of course, in this group, and they're often scarious, as you can see in the Scallansoga in the upper left. The ray florets are generally pistillate, as in most composites, but unlike in some Heliantheae that have neuter ray florets that just serve as flags for pollinators, namely in subtribe Heliantheae that includes the true sunflowers. And the disc florets of Millerieae are often functionally staminate, with reduced sexual expression there. And the fruits are more or less terete or round in cross-section, as you can see in the Scallansoga again in the upper left, rather than flattened as we saw in Coryopsids and often see in Helianthe in the strict sense. The pappus, if it's present at all, is generally of scales or bristles, as you can see in the upper left again. This group, the Millerieae, also has some strange innovations. For example, in the Melampodianae, that subtribe, we have dimorphic filaries, as in Coreopsids, but the interfilaries in Melampodianae are actually fused to the ovary wall, as you can see in this Melampodium in the lower left. Finally, the Espeletias and relatives constitute a subtribe within the Millerieae that represents one of the most spectacular groups of composites worldwide and is a diverse clade in the high Andes, where they include some magnificent rosette plants that really parallel the silver swords of the Hawaiian Islands in terms of the morphologies and ecologies they've achieved radiating there. Okay, so let's take a break there and launch into looking at other parts of the Helianthe Alliance in a moment. That is, those groups that lack palea in their heads, which represent a big diversity of tribes.